Well, of course, there are no Nobel Prizes for data science as such, but I'm going to argue that essentially there already are in some recent cases and tell you about the underlying confusion this caused, and in addition, what the real pattern is that is leading to these awards. So in October 2024, the Nobel Committee awarded the Physics Prize to John Hopfield and Jeff Hinton. And this would be a typical event where the Nobel Prize is awarded. It happens every year. There's a blue screen. There's some pictures of some people. There's a committee of esteemed Swedish academics, et cetera, and later there will be a dinner where the King of Sweden is going to award something to usually gentlemen in tuxedos, in a few cases female recipients. There'll be a big dinner. You can go online and read about it. What was the menu in 1983 when such and such person received their award. So this is the Physics Prize. The same time, the next day, there was the Chemistry Prize, and that went to David Baker, University of Washington, and to Demis Hassabis and John Jumper of DeepMind. Now, so far, this is the way it always goes. But there were immediately reactions all over the place that this is really strange. What in the world is going on here? If you jumped over on Reddit, on Twitter, so on, you would see a furious stream of content arguing that there was something profoundly broken, strange. What happened? Among other things, people said, you gave the Nobel Prize to a CEO. What? That's Demis Hassabis, the middle person there. Another thing that people regarded as unusual is that 3 of the 5 recipients that I've just listed were Google employees or recently retired. And they thought, this is signaling something bad for academia, that you have to be at a hegemon, et cetera, et cetera. And there were a variety of other discussions about, like, we can't even understand what the committee was thinking. They can't even explain why this prize was given. Finally, after some weeks, there were some, people dug into the papers and studied a little bit. The one paper mainly cited in the Physics Prize was a paper in cognitive science and a specific algorithm in which one of the awardees had some plots, one of which was essentially a sigmoid, and the other was the outcome of some computational experiment. And it just didn't seem that that was ascending the heights of science, and people objected to how could this lead to a Nobel Prize. In addition, there were people who were very interested in the fact that these particular awardees seemed to have done something, relatively small, or like maybe finishing up some effort that involved lots and lots of other people. So Eric Topol, who's a health influencer from the San Diego area, had this tweet where he pointed out that this work all rested on the existence of the protein data bank and on the existence of the ImageNet database, and that 2 founders of those efforts were not being recognized, and what were they thinking? So there was a lot of social media of the what were they thinking, and there was a lot of special pleading of different points of view that ought to have been represented, and so on and so forth. So this October 2024 Nobels were, in my memory, the most contentious that I have seen. Although, perhaps if I were in some field like medicine or something, I might know differently from some area that I don't have expertise in. Now, what I want to argue is that Topol's tweet is the tip of an iceberg, which is very important for us to explore. and helps to explain much better what actually happened and led to these Nobel Prizes that has been in some way obfuscated. So the paper by the physics awardees, or one of them anyway, that is, I think, the real reason for the Nobel Prize was this 2012 paper that was published by Hinton and co-authors, one of whom went on to be a co-founder of OpenAI, in which there were words and there was maybe even equations. None of that matters. What really matters is you go to the next to last page and there's a couple of tables there and there's some bold-faced numbers. And this is a publication paradigm that already existed by 2012. It was getting established during the 1980s, and then over the next 20 years was becoming more and more practiced. There were published data sets. Someone had a workflow that they in some way published or shared. They documented a computation. The papers were usually 8 pages long, and on page 7, there would be some tables and with some boldface aspirationally. And they would be comparing some workflows, like maybe the baseline, whatever the current winner was, with whatever they could achieve with their modified workflow. The consumer was expected to be computationally literate and would be at one of these machine learning conferences. So this model of publication is really a discontinuity in scientific communication, particularly the trend over time, which has only gotten more extreme, that we just look at the tables on page 7. Now, I mentioned one person that wasn't spotlighted, but we could bring more to the fore. Fei Li and her team of graduate students and postdocs, then at Princeton, now she's at Stanford, developed the ImageNet data set by scraping the internet and creating data. Then the data was used in a competition. The competition was out there for people to compete in, and the AlexNet paper, which is the real reason that the Nobel Prize was given, in my opinion, was written as, we're going to try to improve on last year's ImageNet. And you can see here the performance year in, year out on the ILS VRC competition, aka ImageNet competition. And there was a big improvement between 2011 and 2012, and that's the beginning of the so-called deep learning era. And the pop that made in performance led to a great deal of enthusiasm, and Jeff Hinton's company was purchased by Google the next year, and so on and so forth. Huge amounts of money were flowing into the area. I think all of these things are pretty well established. Within a few years of iterations of this, other teams had come along in the annual competitions and surpassed AlexNet, and eventually it was judged that the competition made no sense anymore because it was better than what humans could do. Now, as for the protein data bank that we've mentioned, that's been around for a long time. You can see that the number of depositions there that has been growing since the late 80s, and across 30 years there's been an increasing number of protein structure depositions. And so we know lots and lots of sequences, we know lots and lots of structures, and the idea was originally perhaps just to record all that data for individual people to make individual study. But in the early 90s, a protein structure prediction contest started to nucleate. And at the beginning, it wasn't really a contest. It was more like a happening. And there were people who were trying to do something, maybe with computers, maybe with humans, to predict structures in a very interesting way. They would take a sequence that was known, but the structure was not yet known. And there was an effort to solve for the structure using X-ray crystallography. And so there was this window of time where no one on Earth knew the structure, let's say, and everyone can compete in this thing. But it wasn't exactly competition. It was much friendlier than that, and people came in to just, try their hand at things. It took years, but eventually, after many iterations of this, they had figured out how to measure whether you had actually solved the structure accurately. They had figured out a way thereby to have a leaderboard. They had figured out a way to quantify how difficult a structure was, and they had had a number of iterations of this model. After 10 years, they still would publish things showing, well, here's a structure that we ought to be able to do, we can't really do it right, etc. So there was still progress to be made. It was funded by the government and NIH, hint, hint. Okay, example of a leaderboard that was created at the time. They had already gotten the idea of doing things that involve many teams, and maybe different teams of the same lab would enter and so on, and there would be someone making a substantial leap. This is the same pattern that we saw with ImageNet. Here's the results across time, and you see that in the mid-20 teens, there was a jump up. The initial jump was a physics-based jump of a new set of models that were developed that gave us a bump up in 2016. But then the DeepMind team came on board and brought in lots of resources so that the resources that they were able to bring in just to have a documentary about their team was more than most academic teams could bring in for their entire effort. And so through 2018, this was the kind of progress that you were saying on plots that they typically were making. And then for the next iteration in 2020, it was judged that it was a sufficiently dramatic thing that we could say that essentially the problem is solved. So roughly speaking, 25 years of serious involvement of a community in doing this thing, capped off by a very well-resourced team from one of the hegemons that came in and brought in deep learning ideas and brought in machine learning ideas with resources to carry them off. And you can, you see the results with their Nobel Prize. So the things we learned from this effort was you don't know where this is going when you start archiving data, as the Protein Data Bank did. But it's very important to keep up the effort and accumulate hundreds of thousands of structures. And then over time, you're going to learn what to measure, and you'll maybe fork off totally new kinds of competitions. And a key thing is openness to outsiders and getting lots and lots of people involved. It's a community effort, despite the aggrandizement of one figure that's being made in many of these Nobels. But this is what was really required. So the beginning of that is a new form of publication. It's really that out of the medium came all of these developments. And if you read Marshall McLuhan or any of the later expositors like Andre Muir, they'll explain to you that the medium shapes the mind, shapes the activity. So when the data science tradition began with this idea that we've highlighted, that's where the beginning of all of this new type of Nobel Prize activity began. Underlying it, and coming out of the medium as well, was the idea that essentially a paper is a challenge. Here's what I can do, can you do better? It announces a task and a task performance, and other people can try to improve on it. We can systematize that into a competition like we saw with CASP or with the ImageNet competitions, but the paper publication is what enabled it. And this should be for everyone in this audience who's here because of a new form of publication, namely the Jupyter notebooks. This should be that you understand it's a radical, revolutionary thing to have a new mode of communication as you do, and you will have consequences 10 and 20 years down the road of significantly revolutionizing science. Okay, once the competitions got started, the things that we've seen with ImageNet or that we've seen with protein folding, these are not unusual. This has happened time and time again. DARPA in the 90s ran lots and lots of different challenges on data associated with speech, associated with translation, and so on. The key thing is that the community comes in and people are working like crazy in order to harvest whatever gold they can find. This is these pictures by Sebastião Salgado present a open pit gold mine in the Amazon where many, many people just came to try their hands finding gold. So this is what happens when you set up challenges. People from all over the world, if you're making things really available over the internet, now are involved in trying to do things. There's some underlying people, not only the ones that I've mentioned, who've done a lot to put forward the challenge model. So Jonathan Phillips developed all the face recognition challenges across 30 years. He's still working at NIST, although I guess on furlough. In the competition that he's run since 1992, you can see that Face ID has improved and improved. The left axis is log scale, and this is why TSA now has enhanced things where you just walk through now, because this is what's happened by having these challenges year in, year out. You can't see on here any specific discontinuity for deep learning, by the way. Namely, challenges work their magic, and it's because there's the data sharing, there's the code sharing, and we can all measure our performance and people can compete. Isabelle Guillon has worked for years and years at NeurIPS, for example, in promoting this model of competitions and so on. She was awarded a big prize from BBVA and I think the King of Spain for that. And she definitely is someone whose work you should consult. Her work goes back 30 years really in trying to put forward this model of data sharing, code sharing, and so on. So I feel something has changed in the last 10 years, and what came together was really data sharing, code sharing, the availability of papers that are promoting a specific numerical performance measure, all integrated by single-click access to the whole thing, which means that every reported result is replicated frictionlessly, and you create a community or frictionless research exchange that's sharing what they've been able to achieve. In a paper that I wrote recently, I called this the data science singularity and argue that a lot of the progress that we're attributing to AI is really about this combination of features. You can read about it in Harvard Data Science Review. Okay, this slide is counterfactual, but at some point there's going to have to be recognition from the Nobel Committee. And we know that in economics we're seeing a gigantic effect on the global economy of the so-called AI boom, right? $1 trillion of investment. And what is that invested in? It's invested in the fact that I can go to Hugging Face and download any of many models that have been produced by hegemons and others. and I can get the underlying data sets of any of many benchmarks. And I can actually integrate, as we saw yesterday in tutorials, any of those things into my Jupyter notebooks. I can then distribute those things to my undergraduate students, and they can be using these tools literally within minutes. Like in the space of a tutorial, we were shown exactly how this works. Setting up that $1 trillion investment was the erasure of friction, the erasure of barriers to sharing, and so on. It started with a new form of publication. It continued through making that frictionless, which I think everyone in the audience deserves credit for. I've mentioned here some names. These are people that I know have been at this since the 80s. So if I don't mention you, I'm sure there are people who will one day be honored in this way here in the room. If I don't mention you, these people have been at it, a long time, 40-ish years. Okay, so I mentioned Jonathan Phillips, who created all these face recognition challenges. I mentioned Yann Lequin, who created the MNIST data set along with others. Isabelle Guillon, who shepherded all these challenges, which included some of the ones we've mentioned. And also I mentioned David Aha, who started archiving data for the journal Machine Learning and created the UCI Machine Learning Repository in the mid-'80s. These are all, in my mind, people who began efforts decades ago that are now causing major dislocations in the global economy, in people's behavior, in knowledge transformation. And I would, if I were on the Nobel Committee, I would think it's time to start recognizing them. In any event, their work and the pattern that they set forward is the reason that you could recognize the protein data bank work leading to the protein folding AlphaFold. It's the reason why you could recognize the ImageNet achievement of Hinton and collaborators with the Physics Nobel Prize. And so we can recognize the far-reaching consequences of being able to share data so transparently and frictionlessly. Thanks for your attention.